Hey everybody, this is Tim and welcome to the show. So over the years I've featured a lot of iconic rock and roll homes, most of them here in Laurel Canyon, and I figured it would be fun to pick out maybe 10 of the top ones that seem to surface over and over and over again. So almost all these locations are within a mile or two radius of each other, and I've kind of ruled out the more commercial places like, the Whiskey, the Troubadour, or a recording studio, and I just wanted to stick with the places where they lived, wrote music, and partied at. So let's get started. So today, as it was in the 60s, the central meeting place and true heart and soul of Laurel Canyon is here at the Laurel Canyon Country Store. And I've been coming here at least once every couple weeks for years, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't changed a bit. But, Glenn Fry tells a cool story about the very first day he was in LA. He passed by the country store here, and he saw David Crosby sitting on the steps in that, famous flat-brimmed hat and his green cape, and he had seen him wearing it on a TV show just a week before in Detroit. The first thing you notice when you get in here, it has that old grocery store wood smell. And when you walk down the creaking aisles or wait at the counter, it's impossible not to feel the palpable vibe of history that's here. Jim Morrison described it as the store where the creatures meet, and you can imagine pretty much every musician in the canyon shopping here, or at the very least using it as their meeting place. But right across the street right here is what was known as Love Street, and Jim Morrison actually wrote about this intersection here between the store and the house right here on Rothdale Trail. Now this house is known as the Jim Morrison house, and it's where Jim lived with girlfriend Pamela Corson. Waiting for the Sun was the Doors' third album, and a good portion of it was at least lyrically written right here. His time here was probably the most domesticated and tranquil part of his life, but that didn't stop him from singing at all hours of the night at the top of his lungs and setting his girlfriend Pamela's closet on fire in a jealous rage. There are several plaques and signs nearby to commemorate it, which is strange considering I think the local constabulary at the time did everything in their power to make Morrison and his long-haired hippie cohorts go away. So in 2011, the original house was burned. There was a fire here set by an arsonist, and it's been rebuilt. It doesn't look exactly the same as it did, but it's probably the most popular tourist destination, rock and roll tourist destination here in Los Angeles. But just because it's touristy doesn't mean it's not great. Anyway, the Jim Morrison Love House right here at the country store. So off Laurel Canyon Boulevard and up Kirkwood, up Rid Path, right on Weepaw Way, and we come to one of the steepest streets in Laurel Canyon, Utica. This house on Utica was once owned by Hollywood astrologer to the stars Keough, but in his Buffalo Springfield days, it's where Neil Young called home, and his place was up above the main house in a small shack called, you guessed it, the Shack. But there is another way to see it, and it involves a little more legwork, so let's check it out. On the left or right?
To the left. Right there, with the white windows. Right there.
That's the house right there.
That's the house.
All right, so now we're up at the top of Utica, Neil Young's place down there. And why don't you point out for us where it is?
It's right over there. The one with the white windows.
The one with the white windows.
And has a little bit of a balcony, a deck with a chair on it.
And Utica's right underneath us, so there's like tons and tons of steps up there, right?
Yeah.
Correct?
A lot of steps.
By the way, this is Randy, my good Laurel Canyon friend who knows where everything is here. So, but that's where his shack was.
Yeah.
And that's where he wrote many of his first early Buffalo Springfield songs. According to him, he always used a felt tip pen, and he wrote it on old newspapers because to get paper it was too much of a hassle to go. Also, he had to get rid of his beloved Pontiac hearse because it wouldn't make up these steep canyon hills. And I think he ended up getting a Corvette or something, so probably a little more popular with the ladies that way. Again, this is Utica Drive, and it's the Neil Young house. All right, downtown. So now we're in the Kirkwood Bowl section of Laurel Canyon, and we're about as high up as you can get. And I've been down this little 2-lane road many times because there's a house here that pops up again and again and again. Okay, so back in 65, 66, this was the home of Byrds lead guitarist and singer Roger McGuinn, and the back porch here was the backdrop of some pretty famous photographs. Fast forward to 1972, and it was the rental to Don Henley of the Eagles. And Don Henley remembers the house as being so rickety that the floors were all slanted and it would sway noticeably when the wind kicked up. And as a matter of fact, Roger McGuinn remembers exactly the same thing. So the house came with a dusty old out-of-tune piano. And one day, not long after returning to LA from London, where they had just recorded their Eagles debut album, Don Henley and Glenn Frey used that old piano to finish the song Desperado right here. And I believe they also wrote Tequila Sunrise that day here also. But there was one more famous musician that also rented the place, and he, like the Eagles and the Byrds, had an avian theme to his band's name. And it was David Cassidy of the Partridge Family who rented here for a short while too. And there's a very interesting story about it. Years later, when one of the owners was painting the bathroom, they found jammed between the commode and the bathroom wall a prescription Quaalude bottle. And of course, the name on it was David Cassidy. Anyways, right here, Cold Crest Drive. The next couple stops here are both in Laurel Canyon, and I think they're both arguably the settings for the birth of some of rock and roll's most important music. First is this beautiful home on Lookout Mountain Avenue that was once Joni Mitchell's. She bought it in 1968 with royalties she had earned on her album Song to a Seagull. And I think it says a lot about Joni buying it with the first real money she ever had. And it quickly became a hub of Laurel Canyon, people talking shop, people jamming here, people partying here. And Joni wrote her albums Blue and Ladies of the Canyon here, but I think the most storied episode that occurred in this house was when Graham Nash, David Crosby, and Stephen Stills first got together and sang. Now, I know this is a hotly debated story, but more on that in a bit. As the story goes, Stephen Stills and David Crosby were singing their song You Don't Have to Cry for Joni and Graham Nash, and Graham asked them to sing it for them 3 more times before he unexpectedly joined in with his harmony. The sound caught everybody by surprise. It was something they had never even remotely heard before. Joni and Graham eventually became a couple, and this house actually spawned the song Our House. So the postscript is that Joni never did sell the house. She did move, but she still rents it out. Anyways, Joni Mitchell, Lookout Mountain House. So getting back to that hotly debated story about where Crosby, Stills, and Nash first played the first time, Crosby and Nash claim that it was in Joni Mitchell's kitchen, but Stephen Stills flatly denies it. He said he would never play in front of Joni Mitchell. It was someone that intimidated him with her talent. He claims that it happened right here. This is Cass Elliott's house. Mama Cass Elliott was famous for hosting rock and roll parties that would go on for days, and this house has probably the longest and most impressive lineage than any other in Laurel Canyon. Built in the 50s by young up-and-coming actress Natalie Wood, she would often host parties with guests like James Dean, Dennis Hopper, and of course her future husband Robert Wagner. Cass Elliott bought it in the 60s, and she became the matriarch of the Laurel Canyon counterculture scene, and it was an open door for musicians and artists to hang out, jam, and party. Clapton, Hendrix, you name it, when they were in town, they were here. After Cass, Harry Nilsson owned it for a short time and eventually leased it to Ringo Starr, but in 1974 a tragic fire occurred and took with it much of his Beatles memorabilia. Dan Aykroyd and wife Donna Dixon owned it for years and then sold it to actress Beverly D'Angelo. Both claimed the house was completely haunted by a benevolent ghost, whom both were convinced was Mama Cass. And we've done a longer form vid on that one too, but more on that later. But the Mama Cass, famous Woodrow Wilson, Laurel Canyon house. You know, Laurel Canyon is probably one of the most world-renowned music places in the world, but whenever I casually mention it to somebody, their usual response is, isn't that where the murders occurred? And the murders, of course, were the Wonderland murders, or the Four on the Floor murders, and they occurred on July 1st, 1981, at this rather indistinct house right here on Wonderland Avenue. So the house here was an infamous drug lair and a neighborhood shooting gallery, and there were a lot of high-profile clients, including Chuck Negron from Three Dog Night, who used to visit here almost on a nightly basis. And it was just dumb luck or fate that he wasn't present when the murders took place. Porn star John Holmes was also a regular and had visited the house several times on the night of the murder and was actually put on trial but acquitted after 3 weeks, and the murders remain unsolved to this day. So, interesting little factoid, before this all happened, this house had been rented by Mark Lindsay, who was lead singer of Paul Revere and the Raiders. And years before that, he had rented a house a couple canyons down in Benedict Canyon on a street called Cielo Drive. And after he left there, it was rented to Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, and we all know what happened there. So the moral of the story is, whatever you do not rent to Mark Lindsay. I'm kind of excited to show you this one because it's probably the most out-of-the-way location we've been to. So we're at the very top of Laurel Canyon where it butts up against Beverly Hills, and this once spectacular 7-acre hillside estate used to belong to Laurel Canyon's most unlikely resident, Glenn Campbell. This place is now completely abandoned, and I don't think it's been lived in for a number of years. But I did a little checking, and Zillow says it's still worth about $17 million. Glenn and his wife, Billie Jean, and their 3 kids had been living in this house in the 60s and 70s, and it was during the time he was busy with this Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour TV show. But with Glenn's steady descent into alcohol and cocaine addiction, their marriage soon ended. And ironically, it happened after a heated argument where Glenn had played Billie Jean his demo of Rhinestone Cowboy, and she dismissed it as just a dumb old cowboy song. Long story short is Billie Jean kept the house and kids, and Glenn got the blow and Tanya Tucker. Anyways, the Laurel Canyon, Glenn Campbell estate. So now we're on Shady Oak Road, which is in Laurel Canyon on the Studio City or Valley side. And if you've watched any of our previous vids, you've seen us visit this house several times. It's one of the houses that comes up again and again. Everyone from Jimi Hendrix to the Rolling Stones have stayed here and partied here. And it's up this super long driveway right here. The house actually had an inauspicious beginning, but not one without notoriety. In the 40s and 50s, it belonged to a composer, Carmen, and his wife, Eloise Dragon, who raised their 5 kids here, one of whom was named Daryl and would morph into the captain, and along with Tony Tenille would give the world muskrat love. I want to thank him for that. It was later owned by actor Wally Cox, whose best friend was Marlon Brando, and I would imagine that they must have hung out here a lot. And I think they were kind of the original Hollywood odd couple, but in the mid-60s, it was bought by Monkey Peter Tork, and it really became known as his house. And it was notorious for all the parties that they had up here. And Peter Tork was a nudist, an avowed nudist, and they had a great pool up here, and all the parties were definitely clothing optional. The house had a large rehearsal studio located in the pool cabana, And there were jams with members of the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Pete Townsend, and I think most famously of all, the Rolling Stones used it as their home base during the rehearsals for their '69 America tour, the one that included the absolute shit show concert of all time, Altamont. And by the way, there's also a great view of it from up on the Willacre Park Trail here above it. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young played together as a band for the first time ever here, and painstakingly rehearsed and prepared for their Woodstock appearance in August of '69, and on and on. Stephen Stills eventually bought it from Peter Tork, and I don't think there was anyone of the Laurel Canyon scene of the late '60s and early '70s that didn't spend significant time here. Anyways, the Peter Tork Shady Oak House. So this is smack dab in the very heart of Laurel Canyon on the corner of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Lookout Mountain Avenue. And I'd have to say that the most famous of all the locations featured in this vid is right here. This is or was the site of the Frank Zappa log cabin. You know, the funny thing is Frank Zappa only lived here for a short time in 1968, but virtually everybody in rock and roll that was around at the time has a story about it. So let's check it out. The parties were legendary, and the interesting part is Frank Zappa neither partook in the mind-altering substances nor particularly cared for the whole hippie movement as a whole. As a matter of fact, it's rumored that Frank once kicked out Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull for being too inebriated. He was a workaholic and rarely had time to party with his guests. The house was originally built in 1913 when it served as the Laurel Tavern, and it became home to the cowboy star of the day, Tom Mix, who would throw legendary parties with real Western stars, including Wyatt Earp, and I mean the real Wyatt Earp. But by 1968, the house was destination number one for any touring rock stars and their entourages, and the most famous of, for lack of a better word, groupies, were a ragtag, sometimes band called the GTOs, or Girls Together Outrageously, who included members such as Pamela DeBar, and more or less lived here and were the reason for the never-ending party. But Zappa's stay here lasted less than 6 months, and I think the legend actually looms larger than what actually happened here. On Halloween night 1981, a fire broke out and burned the log cabin to the ground, and it's laid fallow like this since. It was purchased last year by the Laurel Canyon Conservancy and will be opened as a park sometimes in the next few months, which I think is great. We're at the top right now, and I think this used to be called the Grotto. These are caves. There's a lot of caves in the hillside here. There's actually tunnels that go under Laurel Canyon Boulevard to the Harry Houdini estate on the other side. It's a pretty cool place. This is the Frank Zappa log cabin. And just a heads up, we've featured all these locations in previous vids, and I put together a link down below. If you want to click it, you should be able to see them in full. Rock! Anyways, for Tim, I'd like to thank you again for hanging out. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. I appreciate it and like the channel. And again, keep playing it and keep playing it loud. Be kind to one another. Peace out. Bye-bye.